This was the last ride. The thought had been a burr under Flint's saddle for 1,000 miles, a hard, sharp truth that worked its way deeper with every league he crossed. The mountains ahead were jagged teeth against a bruised purple sky, their peaks already choked with the winter's first heavy snows. He pulled the collar of his worn sheepskin coat tighter, the cold a familiar ache in his bones. It wasn't just the chill of the season that settled in his marrow. It was a coldness that had started in his soul and was now claiming the rest of him. He was returning to the one place he had left in the world, a small, isolated cabin tucked into a fold of the high country, not for comfort, but for a final, quiet accounting. The money in his pouch was heavy with failure, each coin a reminder of a life lost on his watch. A boy named Sam, no older than 19, with a foolish grin and hands too soft for the work. Flint had made a call, a bad one, during a river crossing. The memory was a relentless phantom. The churning water, the terrified cry swallowed by the roar, the empty space where a young man had just been. He'd brought the boy's wages back, but the guilt was a debt that could never be repaid. So this was it. He would return to his cabin, hole up for the winter, and let the silence and the snow have him. It felt less like a decision and more like a surrender, the final turn of a card in a game he had already lost. The world had taken its pound of flesh from him over the years, and he had taken his from it, but this last price was too high. He was done. The horse, a sturdy roan named Dust, plodded onward, its breath pluming in the frigid air, sensing the journey's end. Flint didn't urge it on. He was in no hurry to reach the emptiness that awaited him. He had built the cabin with his own hands years ago as a fortress against the world, a place where no one could reach him, and he could reach no one. It was meant to be a refuge, but now it felt like a tomb waiting for its occupant. He was a ghost returning to his haunting grounds. One last time, he thought, the words a silent vow against the rising wind. Then it's done. As he crested the final ridge, the valley that held his property spread below, a blanket of undisturbed white. The pines stood like silent, snow-laden sentinels. But something was wrong. A thin, almost hesitant curl of smoke was rising from the stone chimney of his cabin. Flint reined Dust to a halt, his body instantly rigid with suspicion. He lived miles from his nearest neighbor, a hardscrabble rancher named Barlow, and they had an unspoken agreement to leave each other to their own miserable devices. No one came here. No one knew to. His hand drifted instinctively to the worn handle of the revolver at his hip, his exhaustion momentarily burned away by a surge of adrenaline. Squatters, maybe. Or someone lost and desperate stumbling upon the only sign of shelter for 50 miles. The smoke wasn't thick and welcoming. It was pale and thin, as if the fire inside were small, tentative, and carefully managed. He nudged Dust forward, moving down the gentle slope, not with the relief of a man coming home, but with the coiled tension of a hunter stalking unseen prey. The snow muffled his horse's hoof falls, the silence of the valley amplifying the nervous thud of his own heart. The cabin grew closer, its log walls dark against the snow, the windows glowing with a faint, flickering light from within. It looked occupied, cared for. It was a strange and unsettling violation of the perfect solitude he had cultivated. He dismounted 100 yards out, tethering Dust to a low-hanging pine branch where the horse would be shielded from the wind. The cold bit at his exposed skin as he drew his gun, the metal a frigid shock against his palm. He moved with a practiced quiet, his boots sinking into the deep powder, his eyes fixed on the single door. He didn't want a confrontation. He didn't want anything but the cold, quiet end he had promised himself. But the world, it seemed, had one more intrusion to force upon him. He reached the side of the cabin, pressing his back against the rough-hewn logs, listening. There was no sound of loud voices, no raucous laughter of men making free with his whiskey. There was only a profound quiet, the kind that seemed to absorb the sounds of the fire crackling within. He crept to the window, peering through a small, clean patch on the frosted glass. Inside, a lone figure moved near the hearth. It was a woman. He lowered the gun, confusion warring with his ingrained caution. He watched for a long moment as she moved with a quiet, efficient grace. She was of Chinese descent, her black hair pinned up neatly, and she wore a simple prairie dress of a faded light blue color that seemed strangely out of place in the rustic gloom of his cabin. She stirred something in a pot hanging over the fire, the warm, savory scent of stewed meat and root vegetables somehow reaching him even through the thick glass. His stomach, which he hadn't realized was empty, clenched with a sudden, sharp hunger. On the rough plank table, a place was set. For one. A tin plate, a fork, and a cup. As if she were expecting him. This was beyond strange. It was impossible. He holstered his weapon and moved to the door, his mind racing. He lifted his hand to knock, then hesitated. It was his home. He didn't need to knock. He pushed the heavy wooden door open. It swung inward with a low groan, spilling a wave of warmth and the rich smell of cooking food into the frozen air. The woman turned from the fire, her movements startled but not panicked. She held a wooden ladle in her hand, her eyes wide. They were dark and intelligent, and in their depths he saw a profound weariness that mirrored his own. She was not a threat. She was something else entirely. "Who are you?" His voice was a harsh rasp, unused for days. "And what are you doing in my house?" She didn't answer immediately, her gaze flickering from his face to the snow melting on his shoulders. She gave a small, respectful bow of her head. "My name is Leanne," she said, her voice soft yet clear. "Your neighbor, Mr. Barlow. He sent me away. My husband, he is gone." The simple statement hung in the warm air between them, laden with a grief that needed no further explanation. She had sought shelter. Her presence wasn't an invasion, it was a plea, a desperate, silent request for sanctuary from the cold, both outside and in the hearts of men like Barlow. He saw the truth of it in the way she stood, poised between hope and fear, waiting for his judgment. Flint closed the door behind him, shutting out the wind. The warmth of the cabin was a physical shock, thawing the numbness in his face and hands. He looked around the small room. It was his, yet it was not. The layer of dust that had coated every surface was gone. His spare blanket was folded neatly on his cot. The floor was swept clean. She had not merely taken shelter. She had brought a semblance of order to his chaotic solitude. He leaned his rifle against the wall by the door and unbuckled his gun belt, laying it carefully on a small shelf. It was a gesture of trust, or perhaps just weariness. He was too tired for a fight. "Your husband," he said, his voice a little softer now. "What happened to him?" Leanne turned back to the fire, her shoulders slumping slightly. "His name was Chin," she began, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "We came from the coast, to work. Mr. Barlow hired him for the season, to help with his livestock. He was a good man, a strong worker." She paused, and Flint waited, sensing the difficulty of her words. "There was an accident with a fence post, a new one they were setting. Mr. Barlow was careless with the rope. The log, it fell. It was very fast." Her voice didn't break, but a deep tremor of sorrow ran through it. Flint knew Barlow. He was a man who cut corners, a man whose laziness often shaded into outright cruelty. An accident born of carelessness sounded exactly like his brand of work. "Barlow said it was not his fault," Leanne continued, her back still to him. "He said Chin was clumsy. He gave me $10 and told me to be gone from his property before the next snow. He did not want complications." Complications. A dead Chinese worker was a complication. A grieving widow even more so. Flint felt a familiar, bitter anger rise in his throat. It was the way of the world he was trying to leave behind, a world where the powerful crushed the weak and then washed their hands of the mess. "There was nowhere to go," she said, finally turning to face him. Her expression was one of quiet dignity, but her eyes held the stark terror of a person cast out into a deadly wilderness. "Chin once pointed out this cabin. He said a man lived here. A quiet man, he said, not a cruel one. I did not know where else to turn. The storm was coming." He stood there, a large, weather-beaten man filling his own doorway, and felt the weight of her story settle over him. She had walked here through the snow, with nothing but $10 and a dead man's memory of a quiet neighbor. She had found his cabin empty, broken the lock on the pantry, and used his meager supplies to make a meal, not just for herself, but for the man who owned the house, the man who held her immediate fate in his hands. It was an act of desperate hope, a gamble on the faint praise of her dead husband. Flint looked at her, truly looked at her, at the faint lines of exhaustion around her eyes, the strength in the set of her jaw, the way her hands, though trembling slightly, were held steady. He saw his own despair mirrored in her, but hers was a fight for survival, while his was a retreat into oblivion. The ghost of the boy, Sam, rose in his mind. He had failed to save that boy. He had run from the responsibility, from the accusing eyes of the other men on the drive. Now, here was another soul, adrift and in peril, who had landed on his doorstep. To turn her out would be a cruelty worthy of Barlow himself. It would be another failure, another life he allowed to be extinguished by indifference. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions. His entire being screamed for the solitude he had craved, for the clean, uncomplicated end he had planned. But her presence was a disruption, a moral test he had not anticipated. He was being asked to be the man her husband had believed him to be, not a cruel one. Could he live up to that? Could he stand to have another person's life tangled up with his own, even for a short while? He walked over to the table and pulled out the single chair. He gestured for her to serve the stew. "The thaw," he said, his voice low and final. "You can stay until the spring thaw. Then you'll have to move on." It wasn't a promise of forever. It was a temporary truce with the world, a postponement of his own quiet end. But it was enough. A flicker of profound relief crossed her face, so powerful it was like watching the sun break through heavy clouds. She nodded, unable to speak, and turned to ladle the thick, fragrant stew onto the tin plate. The decision hung in the air, solid and irrevocable. Flint shrugged off his heavy coat, the smell of pine and cold leather clinging to it, and hung it on a peg by the door. The simple domestic act felt foreign. He moved about the cabin with a stiff awkwardness, suddenly a stranger in his own home. He was acutely aware of Leanne's presence, of the soft sounds of her movements as she brought the plate and a piece of dark bread to the table. He was used to absolute silence, broken only by the wind or the crackle of the fire. Now there was the whisper of her dress, the quiet clink of the ladle against the pot. These were the sounds of life, and they felt like an intrusion on his carefully curated emptiness. He took his customary place at the table while she stood near the hearth, as if waiting for permission to serve herself. The role of host was one he hadn't played in years, and the social rules felt like a language he'd long forgotten. He cleared his throat. "There's another plate in the crate by the pantry," he said, the words feeling clumsy in his mouth. "Eat." She retrieved it without a word, her movements economical and graceful. They ate in a silence that was different from the one he was used to. It wasn't empty. It was charged with the gravity of their situation. Two strangers bound by a tragedy and a snowstorm, sharing a meal in a tiny cabin at the edge of the world. He focused on the stew. It was rich and deeply flavorful, made with salted pork from his stores, wild carrots and onions she must have found in his root cellar, and herbs he didn't recognize. It was the best food he'd had in months, maybe years. It was food made with care, with intention. He watched her across the table. She ate slowly, her gaze mostly directed at her plate. She seemed to be gathering her strength, her composure. He felt a grudging respect for her resilience. She had lost her husband, been cast out by a callous employer, and walked through a frozen wilderness to throw herself on the mercy of a stranger. And yet here she sat, with a quiet poise that spoke of an inner fortitude he could only marvel at. The cabin felt warmer now, and it wasn't just the fire. It was her. Her life force, however battered, was pushing back against the cold inertia that had settled over the place, and over him. He finished his stew and pushed the plate away, feeling a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the food. It was a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a very long time, a feeling so faint he could barely name it. It felt like a thaw, not of the snow outside, but of something frozen deep within him. He found himself wanting to break the silence, not to fill the space, but to understand the person sitting across from him. "The herbs," he said, his voice still rough. "In the stew. They're good." A small, hesitant smile touched her lips for the first time. It transformed her face, softening the lines of grief and worry. "Ginger," she said, "and star anise. I carried them with me. They are a memory of home." Home. The word landed softly between them. For him, this cabin was a final destination, a place to end things. For her, home was a distant memory, a place she could likely never return to. The simple statement revealed a universe of loss. He nodded slowly, accepting the small, precious piece of her history. He didn't offer any stories of his own. His past was a landscape of ghosts and regrets, a place he had no desire to revisit, let alone share. After the meal, she cleared the plates, washing them in a basin with hot water from the fire. He watched her, this small, determined woman who had quietly and efficiently taken over the running of his house. He should have resented it. He should have felt his solitude being invaded, his routines disrupted. But instead, he felt a strange sense of rightness, as if a missing piece he never knew was gone had quietly clicked into place. Later, as he prepared for sleep, he laid his spare bedroll in an extra woolen blanket near the hearth, the warmest part of the cabin. He did it without a word, and she accepted it with a silent nod of gratitude. He lay on his cot, staring into the darkness, listening to the new sound of another person's soft breathing in the room. The silence was gone. His tomb had a visitor, and for the first time in a long time, the ghost of the dead boy Sam did not come to him in the dark. Days bled into a week, then two. A quiet, unspoken rhythm established itself within the four walls of the cabin. Flint rose before dawn, as was his habit, to tend to his horse and chop wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe the only sound in the frozen morning air. When he returned, stamping the snow from his boots, the cabin would be warm, the fire stoked, and a pot of coffee would be brewing. Leanne was a quiet and constant presence. She moved through the small space with a purpose that was both gentle and unyielding. She mended his clothes with neat, almost invisible stitches, organized his chaotic pantry, and cooked meals that were simple but nourishing. They rarely spoke more than a few necessary words. "More wood is needed. The flour is running low. A storm is coming from the north." Yet, a different kind of communication was growing between them. It was in the small, considerate actions. He began clearing a wider path for her to the woodpile. He started bringing in fragrant pine boughs to freshen the cabin's air. One afternoon, after a brief thaw, he found a single, stubborn winter crocus pushing through the snow and left it in a cup of water on the table. He returned later to find she had placed it by the window, a small spot of color in their monochrome world. She, in turn, learned his habits. She knew he preferred his coffee black and strong. She knew he liked to sit and clean his tack by the fire after dinner. She would simply leave him to it, but the silence she shared with him was comfortable, not empty. It was a silence of mutual respect for each other's solitude, a shared space where they could both just be. One evening he was struggling to thread a needle to repair a tear in his leather saddlebag, his large, calloused fingers clumsy and uncooperative. He cursed under his breath, frustrated. Leanne looked up from the socks she was darning and quietly came over. She held out her hand. "May I?" she asked softly. He grunted and handed her the needle and thread. With nimble, certain fingers, she threaded it on the first try and handed it back. A small, almost imperceptible smile played on her lips. "Your hands are made for axes, not needles, I think." He found himself smiling back, a rusty, unfamiliar motion. "I reckon you're right." The moment was small, insignificant, but it was a crack in the ice, a brief flash of warmth and humor that humanized them to each other. He was not just a grim protector. She was not just a grateful refugee. They were two people, finding their way in an unlikely partnership. The winter deepened, locking them further into their shared isolation. A blizzard descended from the mountains, a howling monster of wind and snow that shook the very foundations of the cabin. For 3 days they were trapped inside, the world outside erased by a swirling vortex of white. The wind shrieked through the chinks in the logs, a mournful, lonely sound that seemed to worm its way inside Flint's head, stirring up the ghosts he had managed to keep at bay. On the 3rd night of the storm, sleep would not come. He sat by the fire, long after Leanne had retired to her bedroll, staring into the hypnotic dance of the flames. The howling wind sounded like a cry of accusation. He saw the churning river, the boy's terrified face, the moment his own certainty had shattered and sent a young man to his death. The guilt was a physical weight, a cold stone in his gut. He didn't hear her rise, but he sensed her presence beside him. She stood there for a moment, wrapped in a blanket, before sinking down to sit on the floor a few feet away, sharing the warmth of the fire. She didn't speak, simply sat with him in his vigil. "You do not sleep," she stated quietly, not a question, but an observation. He shook his head, his gaze never leaving the fire. "Too loud," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the windows. "The wind." "It is not the wind that keeps you awake," she replied, her voice gentle but knowing. "Your ghosts are loud tonight." Her perception was so direct, so accurate, it broke through his defenses. He had spent months running from this, burying it under miles and exhaustion, and this quiet woman had seen right through to the rotten core of him in a few short weeks. A ragged breath escaped him, half sigh, half sob. The confession tumbled out, the words clumsy and coated in shame, spoken to the flames. "There was a boy," he began, his voice a low growl of pain. "On the last drive. Name was Sam. Just a kid. Eager. Too eager. We were crossing the Gray Bull River, swollen from the rains. I told him to push the herd from the west bank. I thought the current was weaker there. I was wrong." He finally turned to look at her, his eyes burning with unshed tears. "He was swept away. Gone. Because I made the wrong call. I sent that boy to his death." The story was out, the ugly, simple truth of it laid bare in the warm, fire-lit cabin. Leanne listened without interruption, her dark eyes holding his, reflecting the firelight in an ocean of empathy. When he finished, the silence that followed was not empty or judgmental. It was a space for his grief to settle, for the poison of his secret to finally be exposed to the air. He expected pity, or perhaps a recoiling from the ugliness of his failure. He had judged himself a coward and a fool, and he expected the world, and her, to do the same. But she did not look away. "In my village," she said, her voice a soft anchor in the storm raging both outside and within him, "there is a saying, When you carry a sorrow for another, you must build a small boat of paper and send it down the river. You watch it until it is gone from sight. The river does not forget the boat, but you are no longer the one who must carry it." He stared at her, the simple poetry of the image cutting through his haze of self-loathing. "It was my fault," he insisted, the words a raw whisper. "The boat doesn't change that." "No," she agreed, her gaze unwavering. "It does not change what happened, but it allows you to stand on the shore again. You cannot save anyone if you are drowning too." She hesitated for a fraction of a second, then reached out and laid her hand gently on his forearm. Her touch was light, almost tentative, but it sent a jolt of profound warmth through him that had nothing to do with the fire. It was the first time they had touched, beyond the accidental brushing of hands. It was an anchor in the storm of his guilt, a simple human connection that said, "I see your pain. You are not alone in it." He looked down at her small, slender hand on his rugged, scarred arm. He didn't pull away. He let the warmth sink in, a balm on a wound he thought would never heal. He had returned to this cabin to die, to let the winter of his soul consume him. But this woman, this gentle, resilient stranger, had brought with her a quiet spring. She had met his despair not with judgment or false comfort, but with a shared understanding of loss. Her grief for her husband and his guilt for the boy were different sorrows, but they flowed from the same river of human pain. He slowly, deliberately, turned his arm and covered her hand with his own. The storm raged outside, but inside the small cabin a profound quiet had fallen. It was the beginning of peace, the beginning of a thaw he never thought would come.